For 10 years she sent him the engines nobody else could fix. She never once sent a thank you, and she never once asked his name. The truck arrived at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning, the same way it had arrived on a Tuesday morning for the better part of a decade. Same white truck. Same Cross Automotive logo on the side panel, the stylized C in dark chrome that appeared on the grills of vehicles that cost more than most people's houses. Same driver, a man in his 40s named Pete, who had been making this particular delivery long enough that he no longer checked the address against his manifest. He knew the way. He pulled into the forecourt of Holt's garage, executed the same three-point turn he always executed to back the truck up to the open bay doors, and killed the engine without ceremony. James Holt was already at the workbench when he heard the truck. He did not go out immediately. He finished the torque sequence. He was in the middle of 16 foot-pounds applied evenly, the kind of work that does not forgive interruption. Set the wrench down with the deliberate care of someone who respects his tools, wiped his hands on the cloth tucked into his belt, and walked out. Pete had the rear doors open by the time James reached the forecourt. The morning was cool and flat, the kind of autumn Tuesday that carries no particular promise in either direction. James looked into the back of the truck. For engine blocks, each one sitting in its steel cradle, each one tagged with the same red rejection sticker Cross Automotive used for components their internal team had assessed and written off. The stickers said the same thing they always said: beyond viable repair. The font was small and businesslike, the language of an organization that had decided something was finished and wanted the paperwork to reflect that decision cleanly. James looked at the four engines the way a doctor looks at a chart. Not with emotion, but with the particular focused attention of someone beginning an assessment. The first one he could already see had a cracked block along the left cylinder bank, the fracture running in the direction that meant thermal stress rather than impact. The second had a seized crankshaft, the kind of seizing that came from oil starvation over a long period. Someone had ignored a warning signal for months before this engine gave up entirely. The third and fourth were less immediately readable. He would need them on the bench. Pete handed him the paperwork. James signed where Pete indicated, the same 4 lines he always signed, and Pete tore off the customer copy and held it out without making eye contact. He never made eye contact. James had thought about this for a while in the early years, and had eventually arrived at the conclusion that it was not rudeness. It was simply that Pete did not think of this as a transaction between two people. He thought of it as a delivery. The distinction was small, and it did not matter, and James had made his peace with it somewhere around year 4. Pete closed the truck doors, climbed back into the cab, and reversed out of the forecourt. The whole exchange had taken 6 minutes. It had taken 6 minutes every time for 10 years, and in all of that time Vivian Cross had not once been present for it. James had never met her. He knew her name from the letterhead on the payment confirmations that arrived by email on the last working day of each month. Reliable as weather. He knew the logo from the truck. He knew nothing else about her, and she, he was entirely certain, knew nothing at all about him. He stood in the forecourt for a moment after the truck turned onto the main road and disappeared. It was not a contemplative pause, or not only that. He was listening to the silence the truck left behind, which was the silence of a Tuesday morning in a small garage on the edge of a town that did not have much reason to be notable, and finding it, as he usually found it, sufficient. The sound came from the doorway behind him. His daughter Nora was standing at the threshold of the garage in her school uniform, 9 years old, dark-haired, with the particular upright posture of a child who has decided that the world is something to be observed carefully before committing to an opinion about it. She was holding her tin of colored pencils in both hands in front of her, the way she always held it when she was thinking about something else. She looked at the 4 engine blocks sitting in the forecourt, and then she looked at her father. "Are these the broken ones again?" she asked. James looked at his daughter. The morning light was coming in low and level from the east, the way it came in at this time of year, and it caught the side of her face and the tin of pencils and the Cross Automotive logo on the nearest engine crate, all in the same unhurried light. "They always are," he said. Nora considered this information with the seriousness she applied to most information. She looked at the engines once more, then back at her father, then at the engines again. Then she asked if he was going to fix them. James picked up the first engine crate by its handles and began walking it into the bay. It weighed 43 kilograms. He carried it without adjustment to his posture. He always did, he said. Nora watched him carry the first one in, then the second. Then she went back inside to finish her breakfast before school. The tin of pencils went with her. James brought in the third engine block and then the fourth, and he lined them up in the order he would work through them, and he stood before them for a moment with his hands on his hips in the way he always stood before a problem. Not daunted, not performing confidence, simply present. And then he went to make a pot of tea because some things should begin properly. In the locked cabinet at the back of the garage, behind the invoices and the parts catalogs, sat 10 years of work that Vivian Cross did not know existed. She would, by the end of the week. James Holt was 44 years old and had the particular stillness of a man who had stopped needing the world to confirm what he already knew about himself. It was not arrogance. People who met him for the first time sometimes mistook it for distance, for the careful reserve of someone who did not invite conversation. It was neither of those things. It was simply the quality that settles into a person after they have loved something completely, lost something completely, and found, on the other side of both experiences, that they are still standing and that standing is enough. He had grown up in this town, in a house 3 streets from the garage he now owned, the son of a man who fixed things for a living and believed, with a quiet conviction he never needed to articulate, that there was no more honest work available to a person. James had absorbed this belief the way children absorb the beliefs that are lived rather than spoken, and he had carried it with him through everything that followed, through the scholarship, through the degree, through the 15 years that took him further from this town than he had ever imagined going. He had been 26 when Rolls-Royce hired him. Not the car division, the aerospace and power systems division, the part of the company that built engines for things that needed to work perfectly every time because the alternative was not inconvenience but catastrophe. He had been brought in as a junior architect on the advanced powertrain team and had lasted in that role for less than 2 years before the work he was producing made the junior designation impossible to maintain with a straight face. What James had was not simply technical knowledge, though his technical knowledge was exceptional. What he had was a quality of attention that his team principal, a Dutchman named Voss who had been building engines for 30 years and did not distribute praise carelessly, described once in a performance review as the closest thing to engineering intuition he had encountered in a human being. James could hold a complex system in his mind in its entirety, not as a diagram, not as a sequence of components, but as a living thing with tendencies and vulnerabilities and the particular logic of something that had been designed by many hands across many years and had therefore become, over time, something slightly different from what any of those hands had originally intended. He understood engines the way musicians understand music, not just the notes but the space between them. By his mid-30s, he held 3 international patents. The fuel efficiency architecture he developed for Rolls-Royce's 7th-generation marine turbine had been the subject of 17 papers by engineers at other institutions trying to understand how it worked. 2 of those papers had reached conclusions that were partially right. None of them had reached the conclusion that was entirely right, because the part that was entirely right lived in James's head, and he had not written it down in a form anyone outside the division could access. He met Claire at 31, at a conference in Stuttgart that neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. She was a materials scientist with a precise mind and an inexhaustible supply of opinions about food, literature, regional architecture, and the reliability of British weather forecasting, all of which she delivered with a directness that James found, from the first conversation, entirely without parallel. They were married inside 18 months. Nora arrived 2 years after that, small and dark-haired and immediately, obviously, operating on her own internal logic that bore only a passing relationship to the expectations of the adults around her. Claire's diagnosis came when Nora was 2. James reduced his hours. Then he reduced them further. Then he stopped counting hours entirely and started counting days. Days at the hospital, days at home, days that were good and days that were not good and days that were the particular kind of difficult that does not have a name because naming it would require acknowledging it fully, and there were things he needed to keep doing regardless of whether he acknowledged them. Claire died on a Wednesday in March when Nora was 3 years old and the daffodils in the hospital garden were making their entirely indifferent appearance in the flower beds outside the window. James sat beside her for an hour after. Then he called his mother. Then he went home to his daughter. He resigned from Rolls-Royce the following month. Not with anger, not with grief performed for an audience. Simply with the clear-eyed practicality of a man who had done a calculation and arrived at an answer that did not require further deliberation. Nora needed a father who was present in the specific, daily, unglamorous ways that the work he loved made structurally impossible. He chose his daughter. He packed up the house in Bristol, drove back to the town where he had grown up, and bought the garage from the man who had been about to close it. He accepted Cross Automotive's first delivery 6 months later. A single engine block destroyed beyond what their team could diagnose, tagged with the red sticker. James had it fixed and returned within 4 days. The payment arrived on the last working day of the month. He had not heard a word beyond that confirmation in 10 years. In the locked cabinet at the back of the garage sat the record of everything he had found, fixed, and quietly documented across every one of those years. Nora had asked him once what was in the cabinet. He had told her it was his work. She had accepted this without further question, with the trust of a child who has learned that her father's answers, though sometimes brief, are always true. What neither of them had said, because it had not yet needed to be said, was that the cabinet also contained the reason Vivian Cross would be standing in this garage before the week was out. Vivian Cross was 45 years old and had built something real, which made what was happening to her now considerably worse than it would have been if she hadn't. Her father had handed her a mid-tier regional automotive parts supplier with reliable cash flow, a loyal but aging client base, and no particular ambition to be anything more than what it was. She had taken it and, over 11 years of decisions that were sometimes brilliant and occasionally brutal and always deliberate, turned it into Cross Automotive, a luxury vehicle manufacturer with distribution across 14 countries, a waiting list on 3 of its models, and a reputation for engineering quality that had been earned rather than marketed. She had done this against the advice of the board her father left behind, against the skepticism of the industry press, against the particular and persistent doubt of people who looked at a 34-year-old woman who had inherited a company and assumed they understood what they were looking at. She had done it by working with a concentration and a relentlessness that left very little room for anything that did not directly serve the outcome she was building toward. What it also left very little room for, though she would not have used this word, was attention. The kind of attention that moves slowly, that asks questions without an agenda, that is interested in people as people rather than as functions within a system. Vivian was not unkind. She was, in the way of people who move very fast toward very specific destinations, simply not fully present to the things that were not directly in her path. James Holt had never been in her path. He had been beside it, for 10 years, useful and quiet and entirely peripheral to the business of being Vivian Cross. The recall notice arrived on a Tuesday, the same Tuesday the truck delivered the 4 engine blocks to Holt's garage, though Vivian did not know this and would not have found it significant if she had. 47,000 vehicles. A systemic fault in the engine sealing architecture of the Cross 7 series, manifesting as a progressive oil migration failure that began invisibly and ended, in the cases that had triggered the recall, with engines that destroyed themselves from the inside with a thoroughness that left engineers looking at the wreckage with the specific expression of people confronting something they cannot yet explain. Her internal team had been working on it for 3 weeks. They had not found the root cause. She had brought in 2 external specialists at significant expense. Neither of them had found it either. The third specialist, a firm from Munich with a reputation substantial enough to charge accordingly, had submitted a report the previous Friday that identified 4 possible causes and recommended a testing program that would take 14 weeks and cost more than the recall itself. 14 weeks was not available. The regulatory deadline was 8. Vivian had read the Munich report twice. In the particular way she read things that were not telling her what she needed to hear, and then she had set it down on her desk and looked at the city through her office window for a while. She was not frightened. She had been in positions of significant pressure before and had learned that fear, while honest, was not useful. What she felt was the very specific discomfort of a person who is accustomed to having the right resource available and has discovered, for perhaps the first time, that she does not know where to look for it. Her head of engineering made 11 calls in 2 days. On the 12th, a retired specialist who had consulted for the industry for 30 years paused on the phone and said a name. Said it the way people say the names of things that should be obvious. Said it as though he was surprised to be the one saying it. James Holt. Vivian had looked the name up in her own payment system. The results had come back immediately. 10 years of monthly invoices. A total figure that was, in the context of what she spent on external consultants, modest to the point of being almost invisible. She had been signing his checks for a decade. She did not know what he looked like. Vivian Cross arrived at Holt's garage on a Thursday morning in a black car that was considerably cleaner than anything that had ever been parked in the forecourt before. She came alone, which was unusual for her, though she had not thought of it that way. She had simply not wanted an audience for a conversation she was not yet certain how to conduct. She stood outside the car for a moment and looked at the garage, the single lift visible through the open bay doors, the workbench along the far wall with its rank tools, the smell of oil and metal, and the particular warmth of a space that has been worked in continuously for years, and registered, without quite articulating it, the distance between this and every other place she had gone looking for answers in the past 3 weeks. James was under a vehicle when she arrived. She could see his legs from the forecourt. She waited. After 90 seconds he rolled out on the board, looked up at her from the floor with the unhurried assessment of a man who was not surprised by much, and stood. She told him who she was. He nodded once, in the manner of someone receiving information they already had. She told him about the recall. She gave him the numbers: 47,000 vehicles, 8 weeks, 3 specialists who had not found the root cause. She spoke with the compression of someone accustomed to briefing people who needed the essential facts and nothing else. James listened without interrupting. He did not take notes. He did not ask clarifying questions while she spoke. He simply listened in the way that very few people actually listen, with his full attention directed outward, nothing running in parallel, the kind of listening that makes people feel, sometimes uncomfortably, that they are being heard with more precision than they intended. When she finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he walked to the locked cabinet at the back of the garage. He had built the cabinet himself 8 years ago, from materials left over from a renovation he had done on the office at the back of the building. It was not decorative. It was functional in the absolute sense, solid, lockable, the right dimensions for the folders it needed to hold. He had been adding to its contents since the first year of the Cross Automotive arrangement, not because he had planned to, but because documentation was how his mind worked. When he fixed something he understood it, and when he understood something he wrote it down, and what he had written down across 10 years of Cross Automotive engines was, though he had not thought of it in these terms, a longitudinal study of a manufacturer's engineering evolution conducted from the outside, by someone with the background to understand exactly what he was looking at. He opened the cabinet and stood back. The folders were arranged chronologically. 10 years of them, each one labeled in James's precise handwriting, the year, the engine series, the fault category. Vivian looked at the cabinet the way people look at something that reframes, in a single moment, everything they thought they understood about a situation. James reached to the final shelf and took down a separate folder. It was thicker than the others. He held it for a moment before handing it to her. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony, simply with the slight pause of a person passing something they have spent a long time on to someone who is about to read it for the first time. The cover page said, Cross-Ceiling Architecture Systemic Fault Projection. The date in the top right corner was 14 months ago. Vivian opened it. The document was 31 pages. It described, in the technical language of someone who had spent 15 years producing work reviewed by the most demanding engineering standards in the world, the exact failure mode now affecting 47,000 vehicles. It described the microfracture propagation pattern in the 7 Series sealing compound under repeated thermal cycling. It described the pressure differential that developed across the oil migration pathway as the fractures accumulated. It described the point at which the propagation would reach the threshold for systemic failure. The projected date fell within a 5-week window. The recall notice had arrived 9 days into that window. On the final page, beneath the technical summary, there was a single paragraph in plain language. It said that this fault, if left unaddressed at the manufacturing stage, would manifest across a significant portion of the 7 Series production run within the timeframe indicated. It said that the repair methodology was documented in the appendix and could be implemented by any competent engineering team with access to the relevant components. It said that a copy of this document had been sent to Cross Automotive's engineering department by recorded post 14 months ago. Vivian turned to the appendix. The repair methodology was 9 pages. It was complete. It was precise. It was, she understood within 4 minutes of reading it, exactly what her 3 external specialists had failed to produce in 3 weeks of trying. She looked up from the document. James was back at the workbench, working on the engine that had been waiting there when she arrived. His movements were the same as they had been before she started reading, unhurried, certain, the movements of someone for whom the work itself is the point and the audience, if there is one, is simply not relevant. In the corner of the garage on her stool, Nora was drawing in her notebook with a dark blue pencil, her tongue pressed lightly to her upper lip in concentration. She had not looked up since her father opened the cabinet. She did not look up now. The garage was quiet except for the sound of James's tools and the pencil moving across paper and, somewhere outside, the ordinary noise of a Tuesday morning in a town that did not know that anything of consequence was happening in it. Vivian held the folder and did not speak for a long time. She read it standing up. All 31 pages, the appendix included. James did not offer her a chair. Not from discourtesy. There was a chair, a wooden one against the wall near the office door, but because it did not occur to him to manage her comfort. She was in his garage. The chair was available. These facts existed in the same space and required nothing further from him. Vivian did not sit. She stood at the workbench and read with the focused speed of someone who has been waiting for information and is now moving through it as fast as comprehension allows. She turned pages without looking up. Once, near the middle of the technical section, she stopped and went back 2 pages and read something again. James heard the pages turn and did not look over. When she reached the final page, she closed the folder. She held it against her chest with both hands for a moment. Not consciously, not as a gesture, simply as the thing her hands did while her mind caught up with what she had just read. She asked how long it had taken him to write. 14 months of evenings, James said. He was fitting a new bearing housing as he said it, his attention on the alignment, his voice carrying the same quality it carried when he said everything level, unperformed, the voice of someone who long ago stopped calibrating what they said for effect. Vivian looked at the cover page again. The date. She asked why he had not followed up when the letter went unanswered. The garage went quiet in a specific way. Not the absence of sound. James's tools were still moving, Nora's pencil was still moving, but a quality of attention that made the existing sounds seem further away. James set down his tool. He turned to face her, not with drama, not with the energy of a man who has been waiting to say something. He turned the way he did everything, when he was ready and not before. He said he had sent the letter because it was the right thing to do. He said he had stopped following up when it was ignored because he had learned, across 10 years of delivering work to a company that sent a truck and a driver who did not make eye contact and a payment confirmation on the last working day of the month, that he was not someone whose correspondence was going to be treated as urgent. He said this without bitterness. He said it the way a person states a condition of their life that they have examined, understood, and declined to be destroyed by. Vivian heard it the way it was meant, as a fact, not an accusation, which made it considerably harder to receive than an accusation would have been. An accusation could be responded to. A fact, stated with that quality of equanimity, simply sat in the room and did not require anything and therefore could not be managed. She looked at the folder in her hands. She looked at the man who had written it. She looked at the cabinet full of 10 years of work that she had been paying for without reading, filing without curiosity, receiving without acknowledgement. She understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than gradually, the specific nature of what she had been doing. Not malice. Not negligence in the legal sense. Something quieter and in some ways more difficult to account for, the ordinary human failure of not looking at what is directly in front of you because you have already decided it is not worth looking at. Nora had stopped drawing. She was looking at her father with the calm, careful attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. Then she looked at Vivian. Then she went back to her drawing. Vivian placed the folder on the workbench. She asked James what he wanted. Not what she could offer, what he wanted. The distinction was deliberate and James registered it as such, with a slight pause before he answered that told her he had noticed the difference. He was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. He looked at Nora on her stool. He looked at the engines lined up in the bay. He looked at the forecourt through the open doors, where the light was coming in at the low autumn angle that made everything in its path look considered. He asked Nora if she had finished her reading for school. She said almost. He asked if she had eaten her lunch. She held up a half-finished apple from beside her notebook without looking up. Something moved between them, the practiced, wordless communication of two people who have been each other's primary company for long enough that full sentences are frequently optional. Then James looked at Vivian. He said he would work on the recall. He said he would do it because 47,000 vehicles represented 47,000 sets of people who had made a purchase in good faith and deserved to have the fault corrected with the same thoroughness with which it should have been prevented. He did not say this as a rebuke. He said it as a statement of his own reasoning, offered for clarity rather than effect. He slid a single sheet of paper across the workbench. His rate, his availability, his terms. 1 page. No cover letter. Vivian looked at the daily rate. She looked at it for long enough that James understood she was recalibrating. The figure was less than a quarter of what she had been prepared to offer. It was not a negotiating position. It was not false modesty. It was the number of a man who had decided, a long time ago and without drama, what his time was worth and had never felt the need to revise that decision upward in order to feel valued. She did not negotiate. She said she would have the contract drawn up by morning. James picked up his tool and went back to the engine he had been working on when she arrived. The bearing housing needed 3 more adjustments before it was properly seated. He made them with the same quality of attention he gave everything, complete, unhurried, as though the presence of a CEO waiting for a response behind him was simply not a factor in how carefully the work needed to be done. Vivian watched him for a moment. Then she looked at Nora, who had set down her pencil and was looking at the folder on the workbench with an expression that was difficult to read and then, on reflection, was not difficult to read at all. It was the expression of a child who understands more than the adults in the room have accounted for, and who has decided, wisely, to keep that fact to herself. Vivian picked up the folder. She had 2 more questions she had been considering asking about the patents, about whether he had documented similar fault projections for the other engine series in the cabinet, about what else might be sitting in those folders that her engineering team did not know they needed. She decided they could wait until morning. Some things are better approached after a person has had the night to understand the size of what they are dealing with. She walked to the forecourt. At the garage entrance she stopped and turned back. She said she had been sending him work for 10 years without asking him a single question about himself. She said she did not have an adequate explanation for that. James did not look up from the engine. He said that most people don't. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply an acknowledgement of a fact about the world, delivered by a man who had made his peace with that fact long before she walked into his garage, and who did not need anything from her in order to continue making his peace with it. Vivian walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment before starting it. Through the open bay doors she could see James at the workbench and Nora on her stool, and the cabinet along the far wall and the afternoon light coming in level and even across all of it, touching everything in the garage with the same unhurried attention. She started the car and drove away. The recall was resolved in 19 days. James worked from the garage primarily, with 2 of Vivian's engineers coming to him rather than the other way around, an arrangement he had proposed in the contract and which Vivian had accepted without amendment. The engineers, both in their 30s, both technically accomplished, both possessed of the particular professional confidence of people who are good at their work and know it, arrived on the first morning with the slight wariness of experts who have been sent to work under someone they have not yet assessed. They left on the 19th evening with something considerably different in their expressions, the specific quality that appears in technically skilled people when they have spent time working alongside someone whose ability is of a different order than their own, and have had the good sense to recognize it rather than resist it. James did not explain himself to them. He did not establish credentials or reference his background or perform the kind of calibrated visibility that professional environments usually require of people who want to be taken seriously. He simply worked, and the work was its own argument, and by the 3rd day the wariness had been replaced by something closer to attention, the focused, genuine attention of people who understand they are learning something they will not learn anywhere else. Nora did her homework at the stool in the corner on the days she was not at school. On those days she was quiet and present in the way she was always quiet and present, her notebook open, her pencils in their tin, absorbing the atmosphere of the garage with the particular receptivity of a child who has grown up in a working space and understands, in the way children understand things that have always been true, that work done with care and attention has a quality to it that is as perceptible as sound. On the 14th day, one of the engineers, the younger one, whose name was Sam and who had stopped trying to hide how much he was enjoying himself, asked Nora what she was drawing. She showed him. It was a technical diagram of the ceiling architecture fault, rendered in colored pencil with a precision that was startling from a 9-year-old. The propagation pathway marked in red, the repair intervention marked in blue, the annotations in her careful, slightly oversized handwriting along the margins. Sam looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at James. James was focused on the bench and gave no indication of having heard any of this, which both of them understood to mean he had heard all of it. The press release, when it came, did not mention James Holt. Vivian had asked him, in the second week, whether he wished to be acknowledged. He had said he did not. She had asked if he was certain. He had said that the acknowledgement he cared about was not the kind that appeared in press releases. She had not asked what kind he meant because she had looked at Nora on her stool and understood that the question had already been answered. 6 weeks after the recall closed, a letter arrived at the garage on Cross Automotive letterhead. It was a formal acknowledgement from the board, signed by Vivian and 2 of the non-executive directors, crediting the ceiling architecture solution to James Holt and requesting his permission to reference his methodology in their internal engineering documentation going forward, with appropriate patent acknowledgement. It also contained, on the second page, a personal note from Vivian that was 3 sentences long and did not attempt to do more than 3 sentences could honestly do. James read both pages at the workbench. He folded the letter with the same care he folded everything, running his thumb along each fold to make it clean. He opened the drawer beneath the workbench, the drawer where Nora kept her spare pencils and the drawings she was not ready to take home yet, and placed the letter inside. Nora was watching from her stool. She looked at the drawer and then at her father. "Is that an important one?" she asked. James closed the drawer. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was his habit with all of Nora's questions. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." Nora accepted this and went back to her drawing. She was working on something new, a detailed study of the garage interior from her particular vantage point on the stool, the workbench and the lift and the cabinet along the far wall and her father's back as he stood at the bench, all rendered with the careful, loving attention of a child documenting something she does not want to forget. 3 days later Vivian came back. Not with engines, not with a problem requiring resolution, not with anything that could be described as professional business. She came in the late afternoon, when the light was doing what it did at this time of year, long and level and patient, the light of a season that has stopped hurrying, and she found James teaching Nora how a bearing works, using a disassembled unit on the workbench, pointing to each component in turn while Nora drew it in her notebook with the focused precision she brought to everything she considered worth understanding. Vivian stood at the garage entrance for a moment before either of them noticed her. She was not announced by the sound of a truck or the arrival of a problem or any of the things that had always preceded her connection to this place. She was just a person standing at the threshold of a space that had been here, doing what it did, long before she had thought to pay attention to it. James looked up. His expression carried no surprise and no performance. He looked the way he always looked, present, unhurried, entirely himself. Vivian asked if she was interrupting. James looked at Nora, who was still drawing, tongue pressed lightly to her lip, the bearing unit in front of her and the notebook open and the colored pencils arranged in the order she always arranged them. He looked back at Vivian. He said not particularly. Vivian came in. She looked at the diagram Nora was making, precise, careful, the component labels written in her particular handwriting. She looked at the cabinet along the far wall. She looked at James at the workbench with the bearing unit between them and his daughter beside him, drawing what he showed her with the steady, serious attention of a child who understands that what she is being given is worth keeping. She asked if he ever missed it. The circuits, the championships his patents had outlasted, the world he had walked away from at the height of what it was offering him. James looked at his daughter. Nora was shading a component with the side of her pencil, producing the particular depth that she had been practicing for several weeks and was getting right more often now than not. He said no. Vivian looked at the notebook page. She looked at the drawing, precise, small, made with care and colored pencils in the corner of a garage on a Thursday afternoon, by a 9-year-old who had grown up watching her father give his complete attention to whatever was in front of him. She did not ask anything further. Some answers make every other question not exactly irrelevant but unnecessary, already contained, already resolved, already at rest in the space where the question used to be. The afternoon light moved across the garage floor in its slow, level way. James went back to the bearing. Nora went back to the drawing. The tin of colored pencils sat open on the workbench between them, the colors arranged in their order, each one in its place.